Welcome, beautiful souls, to Her Journey, the channel where we dive deep into the raw, powerful stories of women who defied the odds, found their strength, and delivered a dose of unforgettable justice. Don't just listen and leave. Hit subscribe so you'll never miss another story that speaks to your soul. Today, we're talking about a betrayal so profound, it struck at the very core of trust and family. Imagine driving for hours through a raging storm just to celebrate your son, only to overhear him wish you dead. But what if that whisper of malice, that moment of ultimate cruelty, was the very spark that ignited a firestorm? A firestorm fueled by a mother's quiet power, leading to a reckoning so swift and devastating it would leave him crying like a baby. This is Miriam's story. This is her journey. And trust me, you won't want to miss how this one ends. They say a mother's love knows no bounds. For 32 years, I lived by those words. I believed them with every fiber of my being, even when life tested that faith in the cruelest ways imaginable. My name is Miriam Elon, and at 55, I've learned that beauty isn't just about the curve of your cheekbone or the way light catches your eyes, though I've been blessed with both. True beauty comes from an unbreakable spirit, and mine was about to be tested in ways I never imagined. The storm started 3 states away from Daniel's apartment in Chicago. I should have taken it as an omen, but mothers don't heed such warnings when their children call. Well, Daniel didn't exactly call. His birthday was approaching, his 32nd, and I wanted to surprise him. After losing his father 2 years ago to a sudden heart attack, I thought our bond had grown stronger. I thought we were all each other had left. How foolish I was. The rain began as gentle drops against my windshield as I pulled out of my driveway in Hartford. By the time I reached the interstate, it had transformed into a biblical deluge. The wipers on my silver Mercedes struggled against sheets of water that seemed determined to blind me. Other drivers pulled over, hazard lights blinking like desperate prayers, but I pressed on. 11 hours. 11 hours of white-knuckle driving through a storm that meteorologists would later call unprecedented. My hands cramped from gripping the steering wheel, my back ached from sitting rigid with concentration, and my eyes burned from straining to see through the chaos outside. But I drove on, because that's what mothers do. We drive through storms, literal and metaphorical, for our children. I had planned everything perfectly. Daniel's favorite chocolate cake sat carefully secured in the back seat, along with the Rolex watch I'd been saving to give him, the same model his father had worn. I imagined his face lighting up when he saw me at his door, soaked but smiling, arms full of love and surprises. I imagined wrong. By the time I reached the outskirts of Chicago, the storm was beginning to ease, as if it had served its purpose, and was moving on to torment someone else. I checked my appearance in the rearview mirror. Mascara slightly smudged but otherwise intact, my blonde hair still perfectly styled despite the journey. Even exhausted, I knew I looked good. I'd inherited my mother's bone structure and taken care to maintain it. Men still turned their heads when I walked by, and women my age asked for my skincare secrets. Daniel lived in Lincoln Park, in a trendy brownstone his trust fund helped him afford. I'd set up that trust fund when he graduated college, ensuring he'd never want for anything. Looking back, perhaps that was my first mistake. I parked across the street, gathering the cake and gift, my heart fluttering with anticipation. The building's warm light spilled onto the rain-slicked sidewalk, and I could see movement in what I knew was Daniel's second-floor window. The front door was propped open, typical of the building's casual security that had always made me nervous. I climbed the stairs quietly, not wanting to ruin the surprise. His door was slightly ajar, and I could hear voices inside. Daniel was talking to someone, probably Marcus, his roommate. I raised my hand to knock, my smile already forming, when I heard it. God, I can't wait for this whole thing to be over. Daniel's voice carried clearly through the gap in the door. I paused, cake balanced in one hand, gift in the other. What thing? Dude, just tell her you're busy, came another voice, Marcus, definitely. You don't owe her anything. Are you kidding? She'd show up anyway. Remember last Christmas? The woman has no boundaries. The woman. Not my mother. Not Mom. The woman. My smile faltered, but I told myself they were talking about someone else. Maybe a girlfriend. Daniel had never introduced me to anyone serious, but perhaps... I swear, Marcus, sometimes I think my life would be so much easier if she just died like Dad. The words hit me like a physical blow. The cake slipped from my suddenly numb fingers, hitting the hallway floor with a devastating splat. Chocolate and frosting exploded across the worn carpeting, but I barely noticed. I was too busy trying to process what I'd just heard. My son, my beautiful boy whom I'd carried for 9 months, nursed through countless illnesses, supported through every dream and disappointment, wished I was dead. Jesus, that's dark, man, Marcus said with a nervous laugh. Is it though? She's like this, weight around my neck. Always checking in, always wanting to help, always reminding me that she's alone now. It's exhausting. Sometimes I wonder if she even loved Dad, or if she just needs someone to control. The gift box fell from my other hand, the Rolex inside making a small, expensive thud against the floor. I stood there, frozen, as my son continued his character assassination. She acts like she's so generous, but it all comes with strings. The apartment, the car, the credit cards, it's all just ways to keep me tied to her. I'm 32 years old, and I can't make a move without wondering if she'll approve. So cut the cord, Marcus suggested. With what money? She made sure of that, didn't she? Set up my whole life, so I'd need her. But I swear, if something happened to her tomorrow, I'd probably feel relief more than grief. I had heard enough. More than enough. Moving like a ghost, I bent down and gathered the destroyed cake and damaged gift. My hands shook as I scraped chocolate frosting from the hallway carpet, trying to erase any evidence of my presence. The beautiful surprise I'd planned, the joy I'd anticipated, it all felt grotesque now, like love letters from a stalker. I made it back to my car without being seen, though I'm not sure I would have cared if Daniel had spotted me. The mother who drove 11 hours through a storm was gone. In her place sat someone else, someone colder, someone whose love had been poisoned by truth. The drive home passed in a blur of rain and tears. By the time I reached Hartford, the storm had moved on, leaving the world washed clean and gleaming under unexpected stars. But I wasn't clean. I was stained with the knowledge of my son's true feelings, marked by words that would echo in my mind forever. I hope she just dies like Dad. As I pulled into my circular driveway, past the perfectly manicured gardens and the fountain that had cost more than most people's cars, I made a decision. If Daniel wanted me dead, if my love was such a burden, then perhaps it was time to show him what life, without his devoted mother, would really look like. The woman he knew. The one who dropped everything for his needs, who smoothed his path, who cushioned his failures. She had died in that hallway. What emerged from my Mercedes that night was someone else entirely. Someone with nothing left to lose and everything to teach. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Daniel's voice cutting through me like a blade. I hope she just dies like Dad. I sat in my late husband's study until dawn, surrounded by reminders of the life I'd built, the family I'd cherished. Robert's reading glasses still sat on his mahogany desk. His favorite fountain pen lay precisely where he'd left it 2 years ago. I kept everything exactly as it was, a shrine to a man who'd actually loved me. Unlike his son. As the first light of morning filtered through the tall windows, I caught my reflection in the glass. Even after a sleepless night, Even with the weight of betrayal pressing down on me, I was still beautiful. My blonde hair might have been slightly disheveled, my usually pristine makeup smeared from crying, but the bone structure remained. The green eyes that had captivated Robert 28 years ago still held their fire. But something had changed in those eyes. Something fundamental. I'd spent the night replaying every moment of Daniel's life, searching for signs I'd missed. Had I been too generous? Too involved? I'd given him everything. Private schools, Ivy League education, European summers, a trust fund that ensured he'd never know true hardship. I'd thought I was being a good mother. Instead, I'd apparently been a burden he wished dead. The irony wasn't lost on me. Daniel's trust fund, his comfortable lifestyle, his very ability to sit in his trendy apartment and wish for my death, it all existed because of my careful planning, my financial acumen, my devotion to his future. Well, perhaps it was time to revisit those plans. By 8 o'clock, I'd showered, applied my makeup with military precision, and dressed in my favorite Chanel suit, navy blue with gold buttons, the one Robert always said made me look like a force of nature. If I was going to dismantle my son's life, I would do it looking flawless. My first call was to Jonathan Blackwood, my estate attorney. We'd known each other for 15 years, ever since Robert and I had first drawn up our wills. Jonathan was discreet, brilliant, and utterly ruthless when the situation called for it. Miriam, his cultured voice answered on the second ring. This is unexpected. How are you holding up? Jonathan had been wonderfully supportive after Robert's death, helping me navigate the complex financial arrangements while I grieved. He knew about Daniel's trust fund, the provisions I'd made, the careful structures designed to ensure my son's security. I need to see you today, I said without preamble. It's about Daniel's arrangements. A pause. Jonathan was too professional to ask questions over the phone, but I could hear the curiosity in his silence. Of course. Can you be here at 10? I'll be there at 9:30. After hanging up, I made my second call to Patricia Morrison, my financial advisor. Patricia managed my substantial portfolio with the same attention to detail I once brought to flower arrangements. She was fierce, intelligent, and had grown my assets considerably since Robert's death. Patricia, I need a complete review of all my holdings, specifically anything connected to Daniel's interests. Miriam, is everything all right? You sound. Everything is perfectly clear, I interrupted, perhaps for the first time in years. Can you have a full report ready by this afternoon? Of course, but Miriam. Thank you. I'll speak with you later. My third call was to someone most people didn't know I employed, Thomas Chun, a private investigator who specialized in financial research. Thomas had helped me vet potential business partners in the past, and his discretion was absolute. Mrs. Elon, Thomas answered immediately. He always did. How may I help you? I need a complete profile on my son's financial activities, business relationships, and future plans. Everything, Thomas. I want to know every dollar he spends, every connection he has, every dream he's chasing. Another professional pause. May I ask? No, you may not. How long do you need? 48 hours for a preliminary report, a week for comprehensive analysis. 48 hours will be sufficient to start. After ending the call, I sat back in Robert's leather chair and allowed myself one moment of pure grief. Not for Daniel, not anymore, but for the illusion of love I'd carried for so long. The devoted son I'd thought I was raising had been a fiction, a cruel performance designed to keep the money flowing. But grief was a luxury I couldn't afford. Not when I had work to do. Jonathan's office occupied the top floor of a glass tower in downtown Hartford, all marble and mahogany, designed to intimidate and reassure in equal measure. I'd always felt at home there, among the expensive art and leather-bound law books. Today, I felt like a predator in its natural habitat. Jonathan rose as I entered his office, his expression carefully neutral. He was younger than me by perhaps a decade, with silver threading through his dark hair and the kind of sharp features that belonged in boardrooms and courtrooms. "You look determined," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "I look realistic," I corrected, settling into the familiar leather. "Jonathan, I need to understand something. If I were to revise Daniel's trust fund arrangements, what options do I have?" His eyebrows rose slightly. "That would depend on the specific changes you're considering. The fund is irrevocable, but there are certain circumstances under which modifications could be made, particularly regarding distribution schedules and oversight requirements." "What about complete revocation?" Now Jonathan's expression grew genuinely concerned. "Miriam, that's an extreme measure. May I ask what's prompted this?" I prepared for this question. Let's say I've received information that suggests Daniel may not be the person I believe him to be. Information that calls into question his character and his true feelings about family. Jonathan nodded slowly. He'd handled enough family disputes to read between the lines. In cases where a beneficiary has demonstrated ingratitude or hostility toward the grantor, there are legal precedents for modification or revocation, yes. But Miriam, such actions are virtually irreversible. Once trust funds are dissolved, they can't be easily restored. "I understand the permanence," I said calmly. "What I need to understand is the timeline and process." For the next hour, Jonathan walked me through the legal mechanisms that could dismantle the financial structure I'd so carefully built around my son. It was more complex than I'd hoped, but not impossible. The trust fund couldn't be revoked overnight, but its distributions could be halted immediately pending a full review. The credit cards I'd provided could be canceled. The monthly allowances could stop. "There's also the matter of the apartment," Jonathan noted, reviewing Daniel's file. "You're listed as the guarantor on his lease, and you've been making the payments directly from the trust." "Stop them," I said without hesitation. "Miriam, that will put him in immediate default. He could face eviction within 30 days. Then he'll have 30 days to figure out how to stand on his own feet." By the time I left Jonathan's office, the legal wheels were in motion. Daniel's comfortable life was about to become significantly less comfortable, and he wouldn't even know why, at least not at first. Patricia had prepared the financial review I'd requested, and we met for lunch at the Hartford Club, where I'd been a member for over 20 years. The dining room was elegant and discreet, filled with the quiet conversations of people who managed serious money. "I've flagged 17 different investment connections," Patricia said, sliding a thick folder across the table. "Some direct, some indirect. The construction company Daniel works for has 3 major investors that trace back to holding companies in your portfolio. His gym membership, his country club fees, even his car insurance, it's all connected to your financial network in some way." This didn't surprise me. I'd spent years weaving a safety net around my son, ensuring that even if he stumbled, he'd never truly fall. Every connection was meant to protect him, to give him opportunities, to smooth his path through life. Now, those same connections would become pressure points. "What's his most significant vulnerability?" I asked, studying the financial web Patricia had mapped. "The development project he's been talking about. Daniel's been telling people he's spearheading a major commercial real estate deal in the West Loop. He's convinced his firm to let him lead the project, and he's already started making promises to investors about his family connections and financial backing." My smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "And does he have that financial backing?" "Not without you," Patricia confirmed. "The project requires a $7 million investment commitment. Daniel's been implying that his family trust can cover it, but the actual available funds are only a fraction of that amount." Perfect. Daniel had been selling a version of his life that depended entirely on my continued support. He'd built his professional reputation on the foundation of my wealth, never considering that foundations could crumble. What happens if that backing disappears? I asked. Professional humiliation at minimum. Possible legal consequences if he's made fraudulent claims about available funds. And certainly the end of his leadership role on any significant projects. I spent the rest of lunch planning the careful destruction of my son's financial life. Each move had to be calculated, untraceable back to me, and devastating in its precision. Daniel would understand that actions had consequences, even if he never understood why those consequences had found him. That evening, I sat once again in Robert's study, this time with a glass of wine and a sense of cold satisfaction. On the desk before me lay the instruments of Daniel's coming ruin, legal documents, financial reports, and a detailed plan that would unfold over the coming weeks like a perfectly choreographed dance. My phone buzzed with a text message. Daniel, as if summoned by my thoughts. Hey Mom, hope you're doing okay. Thinking about maybe coming to visit next weekend if you're free. Love you. I stared at the message for a long moment, remembering the woman I'd been just 24 hours ago. She would have been thrilled by this text, would have immediately started planning special meals and activities for his visit. But that woman had died in a hallway in Chicago, killed by words spoken in casual cruelty. I deleted the message without responding. Let Daniel wonder why his devoted mother had suddenly gone silent. Let him worry about the unusual quiet from the woman he'd wished dead. Soon, he would have much bigger concerns to occupy his mind. 48 hours after my conversation with Thomas Chen, I received a call that would change everything. Not because it contained shocking revelations, I'd already absorbed the worst shock possible, but because it provided me with the precise ammunition I needed for what was coming. Mrs. Elon. Thomas's voice was carefully professional, but I detected an undercurrent of something else. Distaste, perhaps. I have the preliminary report you requested. Would you prefer to meet in person?
Yes.
My home office, this afternoon at 3. Thomas had been to my house before, but I saw him taking in the details with fresh eyes as my housekeeper, Elena, led him to the study. The oil paintings Robert had collected, the Persian rugs that cost more than most cars, the casual displays of wealth that I'd grown accustomed to over the years. Today, seeing it through the lens of my new reality, even I was struck by the opulence. Daniel had grown up surrounded by this luxury, had accepted it as his birthright. No wonder he felt entitled to wish away the source of it all. The report, Thomas said, settling into the chair across from my desk, is quite comprehensive, even for a preliminary investigation. He opened a leather portfolio and withdrew several manila folders, each labeled with different aspects of Daniel's life: financial, professional, personal, future plans. Let's start with the financial picture, I said, pouring myself tea from the service Elena had provided. I offered some to Thomas, but he declined. He was all business today. Your son's lifestyle exceeds his actual income by approximately 60%, Thomas began, opening the first folder. His salary at Morrison and Associates Construction is $85,000 annually, but his spending patterns suggest an income closer to $135,000. The difference comes from the trust fund distributions, credit cards paid from your accounts, and various expenses you cover directly. I nodded. This wasn't news. However, his colleagues and friends believe his personal wealth is significantly higher. Daniel has been embellishing his financial situation in social and professional settings. Embellishing how? Thomas consulted his notes. He's told multiple people that his trust fund contains over $3 million in immediately accessible funds. The actual amount is closer to $800,000, with distribution restrictions that limit his access to $3,000 monthly. The tea turned bitter in my mouth. My son wasn't just ungrateful, he was a liar. He's also been using his connection to your wealth as social currency, Thomas continued. At his country club, He's known as the guy whose mother owns half of Hartford. At business events, he introduces himself as coming from old Connecticut money. He's built an entire identity around being your son, while simultaneously resenting the reality of that relationship. The irony was stunning. Daniel hated me but loved the status that came with being my child. He wished I were dead, but had no problem leveraging my life's work for his own social advancement. What about the professional situation? I asked, my voice steady despite the growing anger inside me. This is where it gets interesting, Thomas said, opening the second folder. Daniel has positioned himself as the lead developer on a major West Loop project in Chicago. The Morrison firm has never handled anything of this magnitude before. It's a $30 million mixed-use development. Daniel convinced them to bid on the project by claiming he had guaranteed family financing for the initial investment phase. How much financing did he promise? $7 million, available immediately upon contract signing. I set down my teacup carefully. And his colleagues believe this? They have no reason not to. Daniel has been very convincing about his family's liquidity. He's shown them photographs of this house, mentioned your art collection, even brought up Robert's former position at the bank. He's essentially used your entire life as collateral for his professional ambitions. The audacity was breathtaking. While wishing for my death in private, Daniel had been publicly trading on my reputation, my wealth, my late husband's memory, all to advance a career he could never have achieved on his own merits. There's more, Thomas said, his expression darkening. Daniel has also been using your name in his personal relationships. He opened the personal folder, and I found myself looking at photographs of a woman I didn't recognize. She was young, probably in her mid-20s, with the kind of manufactured beauty that comes from expensive procedures and designer clothing. This is Sophia Hartwell, Thomas explained. Daniel has been dating her for 8 months. She's from a wealthy Chicago family, old money, very concerned with social status. And he's told her about his financial situation? More than that. He's told her about his inheritance prospects. According to my sources, Daniel has been quite specific about what he expects to inherit when you pass away. The house, the investment portfolio, the art collection. He's been painting a picture of vast wealth that will someday be his. My hands clenched involuntarily. How specific. He told her the estate is worth approximately $15 million and that as an only child, he'll inherit everything. He's also suggested that your health isn't what it used to be since Robert's death, and that the inheritance might come sooner rather than later. The room seemed to spin slightly. Not only was Daniel wishing for my death, he was actively planning for it, using it as a tool to attract and keep a girlfriend who was clearly interested in his financial prospects rather than his character. There's something else, Thomas said quietly. Sophia has been researching estate law. She's been asking questions about inheritance timelines and the legal requirements for challenging wills. My source at her law firm says she's been particularly interested in Connecticut's laws regarding surviving spouses versus surviving children. Surviving spouses? I asked, though I had a sinking feeling I already knew where this was heading. Mrs. Elon, I believe your son's girlfriend is positioning herself to become his wife specifically to gain access to what she believes will be a substantial inheritance. And Daniel appears to be encouraging this belief. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens Robert and I had planned together 20 years ago. We'd chosen each tree, each flower bed, with such care, such hope for the future. We'd imagined Daniel bringing his own children here someday, continuing the family legacy in these beautiful spaces. Instead, he was apparently pricing it all for a quick sale. Show me the future plans folder, I said, returning to my desk. This folder was the thickest of all, and as Thomas opened it, I understood why. Daniel hadn't just been lying about his current situation. He'd been building an entire fantasy future based on my death. The West Loop project is just the beginning, Thomas explained. Daniel has been telling people that once his family's finances become available to him, he plans to start his own development company. He's already chosen a name, Elon Luxury Properties. He's designed a logo, registered the domain name, even started preliminary conversations with potential investors. The name hit me like a physical blow. Elon Luxury Properties. He was planning to build his empire on the grave of mine, using the family name I'd spent decades building and protecting. He's also been making promises to Sophia about their future lifestyle, Thomas continued. A penthouse in Chicago, a summer house in the Hamptons, private jets, luxury vacations. He's essentially promised her the life of a billionaire's wife based on what he believes he'll inherit. And if I live for another 30 years? Thomas's smile was grim. Then Daniel's house of cards collapses spectacularly. The Morrison firm will discover he can't deliver the promised financing. Sophia will realize she's been lied to about his prospects. His colleagues will understand that he's built his entire professional reputation on false foundations. But if I were to die tomorrow, he'd inherit enough to make good on most of his promises, at least initially. The house alone is worth $3 million. Your portfolio is substantial. He could leverage the immediate assets to fund his development company and maintain the lifestyle he's promised Sophia. I walked to Robert's desk and picked up his fountain pen, feeling its familiar weight in my hands. He'd signed our wills with his pen, documents that left everything to me, with Daniel as the ultimate beneficiary after my death. Those wills had been drawn up when Daniel was still the son I thought I knew, before I learned what he really thought of the woman who'd given him life. Thomas, I want you to continue the investigation, but I want you to expand it. I want to know everything about Sophia Hartwell, about Daniel's colleagues at Morrison and Associates, about every person who's been touched by his lies. And I want to know about every aspect of this West Loop project, the investors, the timeline, the financial requirements. May I ask what you're planning? I met his eyes across the desk. I'm planning to show my son what life looks like when his devoted mother actually does die, metaphorically speaking. He's built his entire future on the assumption of my death and my money. Let's see how well that future holds up when both of those assumptions prove false. Thomas packed his files carefully, but I could see the curiosity in his expression. Mrs. Elon, I've worked with many clients over the years, and I've learned not to judge their motivations. But I have to ask, are you certain about this path? Once certain actions are taken, they're very difficult to undo. Mr. Chin, I said, standing to show him out, my son wished me dead. More than that, he's been actively planning for and profiting from the idea of my death. I'm simply going to grant his wish in the only way that matters, by removing myself from his life completely and permanently. What happens to the fantasy he's built without my support? Well, that's entirely up to him. After Thomas left, I poured myself a generous glass of wine and sat in the growing darkness of the study. I didn't turn on the lights. The shadows seemed appropriate for what I was planning. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Daniel. Mom, did you get my message about visiting? Haven't heard from you in a few days. Hope everything's okay. This time, I didn't delete the message immediately. Instead, I studied it, looking for any hint of genuine concern or affection. But all I could see now were the calculated words of someone managing his most important financial asset, his relationship with his wealthy mother. I thought about the Daniel I'd believed I was raising, the little boy who used to climb into my lap during thunderstorms, who'd cried when he accidentally stepped on a butterfly, who'd told me I was the most beautiful mommy in the world. Had that child ever existed, or had it all been performance? Even then, it didn't matter now. That child was gone, if he'd ever been real at all. In his place stood a man who wished for my death, while building his dreams on my grave. Well, Daniel was about to get a masterclass in consequences. He'd learn what it really meant to lose the support system he'd taken for granted, to have the foundation of his lies crumble beneath him. And when he finally understood what he'd lost, when he was crying like the baby he apparently still was inside, I would be far away, living a life built on my own terms, free from the burden of loving someone who wished me dead. The wine was excellent, a 1995 Bordeaux that Robert and I had been saving for a special occasion. It seemed fitting to open it now, at the beginning of the end of my life as Daniel's mother. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. The first domino fell on a Tuesday morning at exactly 9:47 a.m. I know the precise time because I was watching the clock when Jonathan called to confirm that Daniel's trust fund distributions had been officially suspended pending a complete review of the fund's structure and purpose. "It's done," Jonathan said, his voice carrying a note of finality that sent a thrill through me. "As of this morning, all automatic payments have stopped. Credit cards, monthly allowances, the apartment guarantee, everything." I was sitting in my morning room, surrounded by the orchids I'd been cultivating for 15 years. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was dismantling my son's life while surrounded by flowers that required constant, devoted care to survive. Perhaps that was the difference between orchids and children. Orchids were grateful for the attention. "How long before he notices?" I asked, sipping my coffee from the Limoges china set that had been my wedding gift from Robert's mother. Everything in my life was beautiful, carefully chosen, lovingly maintained. Soon, Daniel would understand what it felt like to have beautiful things disappear without warning. The credit cards will be declined first, probably within days if he's maintaining his usual spending patterns. The apartment situation will take longer. Landlords typically allow a grace period, but given the amount of rent involved, I'd expect contact within 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Daniel had 2 weeks of blissful ignorance before his carefully constructed world began to crack. What about the other measures we discussed? Patricia has begun the financial repositioning. The investments that indirectly supported Daniel's professional ventures are being quietly withdrawn. It will look like standard market movements, nothing that could be traced back to you personally. This was crucial. Daniel couldn't know that his loving mother was the architect of his destruction, at least not yet. The lesson would be far more powerful if he believed his misfortunes were the result of random bad luck, market forces, maybe even cosmic justice. Excellent. And Thomas? Mr. Chen called this morning. He has additional information about the West Loop project and your son's romantic situation. He'd like to meet with you this afternoon, if possible. After ending the call with Jonathan, I spent the morning in my greenhouse, tending to my orchids and planning the careful orchestration of my son's downfall. There was something soothing about the routine, checking soil moisture, adjusting light conditions, removing dead blooms to encourage new growth. Sometimes, I reflected, pruning was an act of love. Sometimes it was an act of survival. Elena interrupted my gardening to announce Thomas's arrival. I found him in the study, looking somehow more serious than usual, if such a thing were possible. "Mrs. Elon," he said, rising as I entered. "I have updates on both fronts. Professional and personal. Neither is particularly pleasant." "I didn't expect them to be," I replied, settling behind Robert's desk. The position felt more natural now, as if I were finally growing into the power I'd always possessed but never fully exercised. Thomas opened his familiar portfolio, but today there was a new folder marked urgent in red letters. "Let's start with the Morrison project," he said. "I've been monitoring the communications between Daniel and the firm's partners. The situation is more precarious than we initially thought." He handed me a series of printed emails, and as I read them, my estimation of my son's foolishness reached new depths. "Daniel has been forging documents?" I asked, looking up from an email chain that detailed falsified financial statements. "Not forgery exactly, but creative interpretation of the truth. He's provided the Morrison partners with what he calls preliminary estate documentation, showing liquid assets available for immediate investment. The documents aren't technically forged because they don't bear any official signatures or seals, but they're designed to mislead. I studied the papers more closely. Daniel had created impressive-looking financial statements that made my portfolio appear almost entirely liquid, available for immediate access through his trust fund. The reality was that most of my wealth was tied up in long-term investments, real estate, and art, assets that couldn't be quickly converted to cash even if I wanted to support his project. The Morrison partners are basing their entire bid strategy on these financial guarantees, Thomas continued. They've committed to timelines and budget parameters that depend entirely on Daniel's promised $7 million investment. If that money doesn't materialize when the contracts are signed. When are the contracts supposed to be signed? 3 weeks from today. Perfect. By then, Daniel would already be reeling from the suspension of his trust fund and the cancellation of his credit cards. The revelation that he couldn't deliver on his financial promises would be the final blow to his professional reputation. What happens to Morrison and Associates if the financing falls through? I asked. They've already committed significant resources to this project based on Daniel's guarantees. Legal fees, preliminary construction contracts, design consultants, they're probably in for close to $500,000 already. If the financing disappears, they could face serious financial difficulties. And Daniel's position at the firm? Thomas's expression was grim. Mrs. Elon, your son would be lucky to avoid criminal charges. Misrepresentation of available funds in a project of this magnitude could constitute fraud. At minimum, he'd be terminated and blacklisted from the construction industry. I felt a cold satisfaction settle in my chest. Daniel had gambled everything on my death or continued financial support. Soon he would learn the cost of that gamble. Now, about the personal situation, Thomas said, opening the red urgent folder. This is where things become complicated. He handed me a series of photographs, and my blood ran cold as I studied them. They showed Daniel and Sophia at what appeared to be an upscale jewelry store, examining engagement rings. These were taken yesterday afternoon, Thomas explained. My source at Tiffany & Company confirms that Daniel was looking at rings in the $50,000 range. He put a deposit down on a 3-carat emerald-cut solitaire. With what money? I asked, though I had a sinking feeling I already knew the answer. He used one of the credit cards linked to your accounts. The same accounts that were frozen this morning. I laughed. A harsh, bitter sound that seemed to surprise even me. So, he's planning to propose marriage using my money to buy the ring, while simultaneously wishing for my death, so he can inherit my estate to fund their future together. It appears so, yes. But, Mrs. Elon, there's more. My investigation into Sophia Hartwell has revealed some disturbing information about her motivations and her past. Thomas handed me another set of documents, these bearing the letterhead of a Chicago private investigation firm. Sophia has done this before, he said quietly. I looked up from the papers, startled. Done what before? Targeted wealthy young men with inheritance prospects. In the past 5 years, she's had serious relationships with 3 different men, all from prominent families. In each case, she conducted extensive research into their family finances before beginning the relationship. Targeted wealthy young men with inheritance prospects. In the past 5 years, she's had serious relationships with 3 different men, all from prominent families. In each case, she conducted extensive research into their family finances before beginning the relationship. The room seemed to grow colder as I processed this information. And what happened to these previous relationships? 2 ended when she discovered the men's inheritance prospects weren't as substantial as she'd believed. The 3rd, well, that's where it gets interesting. Thomas pulled out a newspaper clipping from the Chicago Tribune, dated 18 months ago. The headline read, Wealthy contractor's son dies in apparent suicide after financial ruin. Marcus Webb, 28 years old, sole heir to a construction fortune worth approximately $8 million, Thomas explained. He'd been dating Sophia for over a year, had proposed, was planning a wedding. Then his father discovered that Marcus had been embezzling from the family business to fund Sophia's expensive lifestyle, jewelry, vacations, designer clothing. The father threatened to press charges unless Marcus paid back every penny. I felt my hands tremble slightly as I held the newspaper clipping. And Marcus couldn't repay it? He'd taken nearly $2 million over the course of the relationship. There was no way to repay it without admitting to his father that he'd been stealing to impress a woman who was only interested in his money. The night before he was supposed to confess everything to his father, Marcus drove his car off the Michigan Avenue Bridge. The silence in the room was deafening. I stared at the photograph accompanying the article. A young man with kind eyes and a gentle smile, not unlike Daniel at that age. Sophia inherited nothing, of course, Thomas continued, but she'd learned valuable lessons about timing and legal structures. Her research into estate law has become much more sophisticated since then. You think she's planning something similar with Daniel? I think she's planning to marry him as quickly as possible before anyone can investigate her background too thoroughly. And I think she's encouraging Daniel to believe that your death would solve all their financial problems. The pieces were falling into place with horrifying clarity. Daniel's sudden urgency about our relationship, his casual mention of my supposed poor health, his confidence about his inheritance timeline, it all made sense if he was being manipulated by someone who'd already driven one man to suicide for money. Does Daniel know about Marcus Webb? I doubt it. Sophia is very careful about her past. She uses different names, moves frequently, always maintains plausible stories about her background. To Daniel, she's just a beautiful woman from a good family who happened to fall in love with him. I stood and walked to the window, needing air, needing space to think. My anger at Daniel was complicated now by a growing fear for his safety. He might be ungrateful. He might wish me dead, but I didn't want him to end up like Marcus Webb. Thomas, I need you to accelerate the timeline on everything. Daniel's professional situation, the financial pressures, I want it all to come crashing down before Sophia can do any more damage. Mrs. Elon, with respect, that might not be wise. If Daniel faces too much stress too quickly, especially with someone like Sophia influencing him, better he face the consequences of his actions while he's alive than let that woman lead him down Marcus Webb's path. I interrupted sharply. My son might be ungrateful and dishonest, but he doesn't deserve to die for it. Thomas nodded slowly. What do you want me to do? Contact Morrison and Associates directly. Provide them with accurate information about Daniel's financial situation. Make it clear that the promised funding doesn't exist and never did. But do it in a way that looks like routine due diligence, not like information coming from his family. That will destroy his career immediately. Better a destroyed career than a destroyed life. And Thomas? I want you to arrange for information about Sophia's past to reach Daniel as well. He needs to understand what kind of woman he's involved with. How do you want that information delivered? I thought for a moment. Anonymously. Make it look like someone ran a background check, maybe the jewelry store when he tried to buy the engagement ring. Let Daniel draw his own conclusions. After Thomas left, I sat in the study until well past dark, wrestling with the complexity of what I'd uncovered. My plan for revenge had seemed so clean, so precise. Teach my ungrateful son a lesson about taking his mother's love for granted. But Sophia's involvement changed everything. Daniel might be foolish and cruel, but he was also being manipulated by someone far more dangerous than I'd realized. The question was whether my intervention would save him or simply accelerate his destruction. My phone buzzed with yet another text from Daniel. Mom, I have some exciting news I'd like to share with you. Could we have dinner this weekend? There's someone special I'd like you to meet. Someone special. Sophia, no doubt, ready to size up the woman whose death would fund their fairy tale life together. I stared at the message for a long time before responding. I'm afraid I'm not available this weekend. Perhaps another time. It was a lie, of course. I had no social engagements, no pressing commitments. But the woman Daniel expected to have dinner with, the devoted, supportive mother who would coo over his girlfriend and happily discuss wedding plans, she was no longer available. She had died in a hallway in Chicago, killed by her son's casual cruelty. What remained was someone far more dangerous, a woman with nothing left to lose and every reason to protect her son from his own stupidity, even if it meant destroying the life he'd built on lies. The next few days would determine whether Daniel was salvageable or whether he was already too far gone down Sophia's carefully planned path to destruction. Either way, his comfortable life of lies and easy money was about to end forever. The credit cards were declined first, just as Jonathan had predicted. It happened on a Thursday evening at Alinea, one of Chicago's most exclusive restaurants. Daniel had taken Sophia there to celebrate what she believed was their upcoming engagement, not knowing that the ring he'd put a deposit on would soon be returned to Tiffany's showroom. I know these details because Thomas had arranged for one of his associates to be dining at a nearby table, equipped with the kind of discreet recording equipment that made modern surveillance both easier and more invasive than ever before. The audio file he sent me was devastating in its clarity. "Sir, I'm sorry, but this card has been declined," the server said, his voice professionally apologetic but tinged with the particular embarrassment that comes with delivering such news in a restaurant where the average meal costs more than most people's monthly rent. "That's impossible," Daniel's voice, strained and confused. "Try the other one." A pause, presumably while the second card was processed. "I'm sorry, sir. This one has also been declined." "What the hell is going on?" Daniel muttered, and I could hear the panic creeping into his voice. "Sophia, do you have—" "Danny, what's happening?" Sophia's voice was sharp, cutting. Gone was the breathy, adoring tone I'd heard in the recordings from their earlier conversations. This was the voice of a woman watching her investment turn sour. "I don't know. There must be some mistake. My mother handles all the financial arrangements. Maybe there's been a mix-up with the bank." "Your mother handles your credit cards?" Sophia's tone had turned icy. "Daniel, you're 32 years old. It's not like that. It's complicated. The trust fund structures. Look, I'll call her tomorrow and sort this out. For now, can you?" "I left my purse in the car," Sophia lied smoothly. I could hear the calculation in her voice, the rapid reassessment of Daniel's value as a prospect. "Maybe we should go get it." They left Alinea without finishing their meal, Daniel presumably humiliated and Sophia undoubtedly planning her exit strategy. By the time they reached Daniel's apartment, according to Thomas's surveillance, she was already making excuses about needing to visit her family for a few days. But the credit card incident was only the beginning. The next morning brought a call from Daniel's landlord about the missed rent payment. By afternoon, there was a certified letter from Morrison and Associates requesting an immediate meeting about irregularities in financial documentation. And by evening, an envelope had been slipped under Daniel's door containing detailed information about Sophia's romantic history and her connection to Marcus Webb's suicide. I spent that Friday in a state of nervous anticipation, waiting for Daniel to call me. Surely, faced with such overwhelming evidence of financial and personal betrayal, he would reach out to his mother, the woman he'd wished dead, but who remained his only real source of security in the world. The call never came. Instead, Thomas contacted me with an update that was both satisfying and concerning. "Daniel's been trying to reach Sophia all day," he reported. "She's not answering her phone, not responding to texts. Her apartment building's doorman says she left yesterday evening with several suitcases. She's gone." "Appears so." My source at Tiffany's confirms that someone called about returning the engagement ring, claiming to be Daniel's representative. They're expecting him to come in next week to finalize the return and discuss the deposit. So Sophia had cut her losses and run, just as she had with her previous marks when the money situation became uncertain. It should have felt like a victory. I'd saved my son from a dangerous woman who might have driven him to Marcus Webb's fate. But there was no satisfaction in it, because Daniel's crisis was far from over. "What about Morrison and Associates?" I asked. "That meeting happened this afternoon. It didn't go well." Thomas's understatement proved to be an exercise in British reserve. The meeting had been a catastrophe of epic proportions. According to Thomas's source at the firm, a secretary who'd been with Morrison for 15 years and had no love for Daniel's arrogant assumption that family money could buy him a leadership position, the partners had come prepared for a discussion about financial documentation. What they'd discovered instead was a house of cards built entirely on lies. Daniel had tried to maintain his fiction about available family funds, but the partners had done their own investigation. They discovered that his trust fund was currently frozen, that his credit cards had been canceled, that his apartment rent was in arrears. More damning, they'd learned that I had never been contacted about the West Loop project, never agreed to any financial backing, never even been informed that my son was using my name as collateral for his professional ambitions. "They terminated him on the spot," Thomas reported. "Not just from the project, but from the firm entirely. They're also considering legal action for misrepresentation of financial backing." Legal action? Daniel's lies cost them significant money, Mrs. Elon. They'd already paid legal fees, architectural consultants, preliminary site preparation, close to $400,000 based on his guarantees of family funding. They're exploring whether they can recover those costs through fraud charges. I felt a moment of genuine panic. This was moving faster than I'd intended, spinning out of my control in ways that could genuinely destroy Daniel's life beyond any hope of recovery. "Thomas, I need you to contact Morrison and Associates. Confidentially. Let them know that while Daniel misrepresented his access to family funds, the family in question is financially stable and might be willing to discuss compensation for their losses in exchange for avoiding criminal charges." "Mrs. Elon, are you certain? That could be seen as an admission of liability." "I'm not admitting liability for Daniel's lies. But I won't let his stupidity land him in prison, either. Find out what they'd consider as settlement." After ending the call with Thomas, I poured myself a very large glass of wine and tried to process the day's events. My plan had worked almost too well. Daniel's world was crumbling exactly as I'd intended, but the collateral damage was threatening to become permanent. As if summoned by my thoughts, my phone rang. Daniel's name appeared on the screen for the first time in over a week. I let it ring 4 times before answering, my voice carefully neutral. "Hello, Daniel." "Mom." His voice was broken, desperate. Gone was the casual confidence I'd heard in that Chicago hallway. This was the voice of a man watching his life disintegrate in real time. "Mom, I need help. Something's happened, something terrible, and I don't understand what's going on." "What kind of help?" I asked, as if I didn't know exactly what kind of help he needed. "Financial help. The trust fund payments have stopped. My credit cards aren't working, and there's been some kind of mistake with the bank. I tried calling Jonathan's office, but they said all changes have to go through you now." "I see." The silence stretched between us, and I could practically hear Daniel's confusion and growing desperation. "Mom, did you do something to my accounts?" "Why would I do that, Daniel?" Another pause. "I don't know. I've been trying to figure out what's happening. Everything's falling apart at once. Sophia's gone. My job is gone. My landlord is threatening eviction. It's like someone's systematically destroying my life." "How unfortunate," I said mildly. "Mom, what's wrong? You sound different. Cold. Did I do something to upset you?" This was it. The moment I'd been waiting for, dreaming of during all those sleepless nights since Chicago. Daniel, finally asking if he'd done something wrong. "Did you do something to upset me?" I repeated slowly. That's an interesting question, Daniel. I mean, I know I haven't called as much lately, and maybe I should have visited more often, but… Daniel, I interrupted, my voice cutting through his rambling apology. Do you remember your birthday last month? The one where I drove 11 hours through a storm to surprise you. Silence. Long, telling silence. I remember arriving at your apartment. I continued, my voice growing colder with each word. I remember standing outside your door, holding a birthday cake I'd made specifically for you, carrying a gift I'd chosen with such care. And I remember hearing you tell Marcus that you hoped I would just die like your father. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. I could hear Daniel's breathing, rapid and panicked, but no words came. I remember hearing you call me a burden, Daniel. I remember listening to you describe my love and support as chains around your neck. I remember you wishing for my death, as if it would be a relief rather than a tragedy. Mom, No, I said firmly. You've said quite enough. In fact, you've said everything I needed to hear. Please let me explain. I was frustrated. I was drunk. I didn't mean… You meant every word, I interrupted. And now you're experiencing what life looks like when your devoted mother actually does disappear from your life. How does it feel, Daniel? Is it the relief you expected? Another long silence. Then, quietly, Daniel began to cry. Not the dignified tears of a man facing adversity, but the broken sobs of a child who'd finally realized the magnitude of what he'd lost. The sound should have softened my heart, should have triggered every maternal instinct I'd ever possessed. Instead, I felt only cold satisfaction. You wish me dead, Daniel. Consider that wish granted. The mother you knew, the one who would have done anything for you, who smoothed your path and cushioned your failures, she's gone. What you're left with now is the consequence of your own choices. Please, he whispered. Please, Mom, I'm sorry. I'll do anything. I'll make it up to you somehow. Just please don't leave me like this. Like what? Independent? Self-sufficient? Responsible for your own choices? I thought that was what you wanted. I could hear him breaking down completely now, the kind of crying that comes from absolute despair. The sound of a man who'd realized he'd destroyed the one relationship that had ever offered him unconditional love. I'll call you in a few days, I said, preparing to hang up. We'll discuss the terms of any future relationship we might have. And Daniel, those terms will be very different from what you've grown accustomed to. I ended the call and sat in the darkness of Robert's study, listening to the sound of my own breathing. Daniel was crying like a baby, exactly as I'd planned. His world had collapsed, his lies had been exposed, his future had crumbled. So, why didn't I feel triumphant? Perhaps because revenge, no matter how justified, always comes with a price. And that price was the final death of my belief that love could conquer anything, that family bonds were unbreakable, that being a good mother was enough. Daniel had taught me otherwise, and now he was paying the cost of that education. Whether either of us would survive it remained to be seen. The weekend after Daniel's desperate phone call passed in eerie silence. No frantic messages, no pleading voicemails, no attempts to reach me through Jonathan or Patricia. It was as if my son had simply vanished from existence, leaving behind only the echoes of his broken sobs. I should have been concerned. Instead, I found myself enjoying the quiet. For 32 years, my life had been punctuated by Daniel's needs, emotional, financial, logistical. Even as an adult, he'd maintained a steady stream of contact that I'd interpreted as love, but now recognized as management. He'd been managing his most valuable asset, his relationship with his wealthy mother. Without that constant undercurrent of obligation, my days felt lighter, more focused. I spent Saturday morning in my greenhouse, repotting orchids that had outgrown their containers. The metaphor wasn't lost on me. Sometimes growth required completely disturbing the roots, even if the process seemed cruel. Sunday brought Thomas's weekly report, delivered as always with professional discretion and thorough attention to detail. Daniel hasn't left his apartment since Friday night, Thomas informed me, settling into the familiar chair across from my desk. My surveillance indicates he's had no visitors, ordered no food delivery, made no phone calls apart from the one to you. Is he? I found myself asking, then stopped. I didn't want to appear concerned. That would undermine everything I'd worked to accomplish. Alive? Yes. But Mrs. Elon, I'm professionally obligated to tell you that his behavior patterns are concerning. Complete social withdrawal, failure to maintain basic routines, apparent lack of self-care, these are warning signs that shouldn't be ignored. Marcus Webb's newspaper photo flashed through my mind. That kind, doomed young man who'd driven his car off a bridge rather than face the consequences of his choices. Have there been any communications from Sophia? I asked, deflecting from thoughts I didn't want to explore.
None.
She appears to have vanished completely. My Chicago contacts confirm she's cleared out her apartment, closed her bank accounts, and terminated her lease. Very professional disappearance. Professional? Thomas opened his portfolio and withdrew a single sheet of paper covered in his precise handwriting. I've done some additional research into Sophia's background. Her real name is Sarah Martinez, and she's been running romance scams for at least 7 years. Marcus Webb wasn't her first victim, just her most tragic one. The paper contained a list of names, dates, and monetary losses that painted a disturbing picture of systematic exploitation. Sophia, Sarah, had targeted wealthy young men across the Midwest, extracting money, gifts, and lifestyle support before disappearing whenever the financial situation became untenable. The pattern is always the same, Thomas explained. She researches potential targets through social media, identifies men with substantial family wealth but personal insecurity, initiates contact through apparently coincidental meetings at upscale venues. The relationships typically last between 6 and 18 months, during which she gradually escalates financial expectations while positioning herself for maximum inheritance benefit through marriage. And if the men can't deliver what she's promised them they can deliver, she disappears. Usually, the men are too embarrassed to report the financial losses. They absorb the cost as a painful lesson and move on. Marcus Webb was unusual because he'd committed actual crimes to fund her lifestyle. And Daniel? Thomas was quiet for a moment. Daniel never reached the criminal stage, thanks to your intervention. But he'd made professional and personal commitments based on Sarah's expectations. The engagement ring, the promises to Morrison and Associates, the fantasy future he'd constructed, all of it was designed to impress a woman who was systematically planning to exploit him. I should have felt vindicated. My son had been saved from a predator, protected from his own stupidity by my decisive action. Instead, I felt hollow, as if the satisfaction I'd expected was draining away before it could fully materialize. There's something else, Thomas said, consulting his notes. Morrison and Associates have agreed to accept a settlement in lieu of pressing fraud charges. How much? $400,000. They're willing to consider it compensation for their losses rather than pursue criminal prosecution. $400,000. A substantial amount, but manageable given my portfolio. The cost of keeping my son out of prison, even though he'd never know I was the one protecting him. Arrange the payment, I said. But I want it structured so Daniel never knows where it came from. Let Morrison think they're dealing with a family representative or a state attorney. Of course. There's also the matter of his apartment. The landlord has begun eviction proceedings. Let them proceed. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Mrs. Elon, that will leave Daniel homeless. Daniel is 32 years old with a college degree and professional experience. If he chooses to become homeless rather than find employment and affordable housing, that's his decision to make. But even as I said it, I thought about those concerning behavior patterns Thomas had mentioned. Social withdrawal, failure to maintain routines, apparent lack of self-care, the vocabulary of depression, possibly even suicidal ideation. Keep the surveillance active, I added quietly. I want to know immediately if there are any changes in his behavior, particularly anything that might suggest he's considering drastic measures. Of course. After Thomas left, I tried to return to my normal Sunday routine, reading the newspaper, planning the week's meals with Elena, reviewing my investment portfolio. But concentration eluded me. My thoughts kept drifting to Daniel alone in his apartment, facing the collapse of everything he'd taken for granted. The ringing phone provided a welcome distraction until I saw the caller ID, Jonathan. Miriam, I hope I'm not disturbing your Sunday, but there's been a development you need to know about. What kind of development? Daniel contacted my office Friday. Not about the trust fund. He seems to understand that door is closed for now. He was asking about employment opportunities. This was unexpected. Employment opportunities? Specifically, entry-level positions in estate law or financial planning. He said he was interested in learning the business from the ground up, starting over in a field where his family background might be relevant. I sat down heavily in Robert's chair. And what did you tell him? I told him that while our firm doesn't currently have openings, I'd be happy to provide references to other practices if he was serious about changing career paths. Miriam, I have to ask, is this part of some larger plan? No, I said truthfully. This is unexpected. After ending the call with Jonathan, I found myself pacing through the house Robert and I had built together, trying to process this new information. Daniel was looking for work. Not just any work, but work in fields that would teach him about the financial structures he'd taken for granted, the legal frameworks that governed wealth management and estate planning. Was this genuine growth? A real understanding that he needed to rebuild his life on firmer foundations? Or was it simply another attempt to position himself advantageously in relation to my wealth? The distinction mattered, because it would determine whether Daniel was salvageable or whether he was simply adapting his parasitic behavior to new circumstances. My phone buzzed with a text message, and Daniel's name on the screen made my pulse quicken. Mom, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I wanted you to know that I'm looking for a job. A real job, where I'll have to work for what I earn. I understand now that I've never actually supported myself, never learned what it means to be independent. I want to change that. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope someday you'll see that I'm trying to become someone worthy of being your son. I read the message 3 times, searching for the manipulation I'd grown accustomed to detecting in Daniel's communications. But if it was there, it was subtler than usual. The tone was different, humbler, more self-aware, less demanding. It could be genuine growth. It could also be a new strategy. I didn't respond to the text, but I didn't delete it either. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wrestling with questions I'd thought I'd already answered. What did I really want from this situation? Complete estrangement from my only child? Proof that he was irredeemably selfish? Or was there still some part of me that hoped he could learn, grow, become the man I'd once believed he could be? The answer came to me as I finally drifted off to sleep. I wanted Daniel to earn back the right to be my son. Not through apologies or promises, but through actions. Through genuine change. Through becoming someone who deserved love rather than simply expected it. The question was whether he was capable of such transformation, or whether 32 years of entitlement had made real change impossible. Time would tell. And if Daniel was truly serious about starting over, he would have plenty of time to prove it. Because the easy life he'd known was over forever. What replaced it was entirely up to him. The call came at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, jolting me from the first peaceful sleep I'd had in weeks. Thomas's voice on the phone was carefully controlled, but I could hear the urgency beneath his professional calm. Mrs. Elon, I'm sorry to wake you, but there's been an incident. Daniel is in the hospital. My blood turned to ice. What kind of incident? Apparent overdose. His neighbor heard sounds of distress and called paramedics. He's stable now, but it was close. I sat up in bed, my mind reeling between relief and terror. Overdose of what? Combination of alcohol and prescription pain medication. The doctors aren't sure yet if it was intentional or accidental, but given his recent psychological state, Marcus Webb's newspaper photo flashed through my mind again, that gentle, doomed young man whose story had become a warning I'd apparently failed to heed. "I'll be there in 4 hours," I said, already reaching for my robe. "Mrs. Elon, are you certain? If you're seen visiting Daniel, it could complicate the narrative you've been building about your estrangement." "Thomas, my son nearly died. Whatever narrative I've been building can go to hell." The drive to Chicago passed in a blur of self-recrimination and desperate prayers to a God I wasn't sure I still believed in. Had I pushed too hard? Been too cruel? In my determination to teach Daniel the value of my love, had I accidentally taught him that life, without it, wasn't worth living? The morning sun was just breaking over Lake Michigan as I pulled into the hospital parking garage, my hands trembling as I turned off the engine. I'd made this drive once before, 11 hours through a storm, carrying birthday cake and unconditional love. Now I was making it again, carrying nothing but fear and guilt. The intensive care unit was a maze of beeping machines and antiseptic smells that reminded me too much of Robert's final days. I found Daniel's room by following the sound of my own footsteps echoing off sterile floors. He looked smaller than I remembered, diminished by the hospital bed and the tangle of monitors surrounding him. His face was pale, his breathing steady but labored, and for a moment I saw not the ungrateful man who'd wished me dead, but the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. "He's been asking for you," a voice said behind me. I turned to find a young doctor with kind eyes and tired features. Dr. Sarah Chen, according to her badge. No relation to Thomas, just one of those coincidences that seem significant when you're drowning in guilt. "Is he going to be all right?" I asked. "Physically, yes." We pumped his stomach, administered activated charcoal, stabilized his vital signs. He was lucky if his neighbor hadn't called when she did. "And, psychologically?" Dr. Chen's expression grew more guarded. "That's more complicated. He's been asking to see you repeatedly since he regained consciousness, but he's also expressed significant anxiety about your potential reaction to his situation. The combination suggests a complex emotional relationship that may have contributed to his current crisis." Complex emotional relationship. Such clinical language for the destruction of a mother-son bond. "Can I see him?" "He's awake, and he's been cleared for visitors." "But Mrs. Elon," she paused, consulting her chart, "your son is in a very vulnerable state right now. Whatever brought him to this point, he needs stability and support, not additional trauma." I nodded, understanding the warning beneath her professional courtesy. "Don't make it worse." Daniel's eyes were closed when I entered his room, but they fluttered open at the sound of my footsteps. For a moment, confusion clouded his features, as if he couldn't quite believe I was really there. "Mom?" His voice was rough from the intubation, barely above a whisper. "I'm here," I said, moving to stand beside his bed. Up close, the damage was more apparent. Dark circles under his eyes, a grayish pallor that spoke of more than just physical illness, a tremor in his hands that suggested his emotional state was far from stable. "I didn't think you would come," he said, tears starting to leak from the corners of his eyes. "Of course I came. You're my son." It was a simple statement, but it seemed to break something inside him. Daniel began sobbing, not the angry, frustrated tears of our last phone conversation, but the deep, wrenching sobs of someone who'd pushed themselves beyond their breaking point and found only emptiness on the other side. "I'm sorry," he gasped between sobs. "I'm so sorry, Mom. For everything. For what I said, for what I thought, for being such a disappointment. I tried to fix it, tried to start over, but everything I touched just fell apart. I reached out instinctively to smooth his hair back from his forehead, the gesture automatic after 32 years of motherhood. He leaned into the touch like a child seeking comfort. "Tell me what happened," I said quietly. "I got evicted," he said, his voice breaking. "Lost the apartment, had to move everything into storage. Been staying at this cheap motel, trying to find work, but nobody wants to hire me. Morrison blacklisted me in the construction industry, and when potential employers check references." I felt a stab of guilt. My desire for comprehensive revenge had apparently extended further than I'd intended. "And Sophia?" asked, though I already knew the answer.
Gone.
Just vanished. I found out about Marcus Webb, about what she really was, and I felt so stupid. So incredibly, monumentally stupid. She was never interested in me at all. Was she? Just the money she thought I had access to. "No," I said honestly. "She wasn't interested in you. I kept thinking about what you said on the phone, about the mother I knew being gone, about getting what I wished for. And I realized that you were right. I did wish you were dead, not because I hated you, but because I was too cowardly to live my own life. I wanted the inheritance without the relationship, the money without the responsibility." His words were coming faster now, as if he were afraid I might leave before he could get them all out. So I tried to start over. Applied for entry-level jobs, looked at cheap apartments, tried to figure out how to live like a normal person. But I'd never learned how, had I? You and Dad had made everything so easy for me that I never developed any actual life skills. And when it all started falling apart, you took pills, I finished quietly. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, staring at the ceiling. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "I wasn't trying to kill myself. Not exactly. I wanted the pain to stop. The humiliation, the fear, the constant awareness of how badly I'd screwed everything up. I thought if I could just sleep for a while, maybe I'd wake up and figure out how to fix it all. But you took too much." "I took too much," he confirmed. "And when I woke up here, the first thing I thought was that you were going to hear about this and think I was just manipulating you again, using suicide threats to get your attention and your money back." I studied his face, searching for signs of the manipulation he was describing. But what I saw instead was exhaustion, shame, and something I hadn't seen in Daniel's eyes for years. Genuine remorse. "Is that what you're doing?" I asked directly.
No.
His answer came immediately, without calculation or hesitation.
No, Mom.
"I'm not asking for money or forgiveness or for things to go back to the way they were. I know I don't deserve any of that. I needed you to know that I understand what I lost, what I threw away, and that I'm sorry." I sat in the visitor's chair beside his bed, trying to process the complexity of what I was feeling. Relief that he was alive, certainly. Guilt over my role in pushing him to this point. But also something else, a faint stirring of hope that perhaps Daniel was finally beginning to understand the cost of his choices. "The job search," I said. "Jonathan told me you were looking for work in estate law. I thought maybe if I learned about the business, understood how wealth actually works instead of just spending it, I might become someone worthy of being your son again. But it doesn't matter now. No law firm is going to hire someone who just overdosed in a motel room." "That depends on how you frame the narrative," I said carefully. "A young man who made serious mistakes, hit rock bottom, and is committed to rebuilding his life from the ground up might be more attractive to certain employers than you think." Daniel looked at me with something approaching wonder. "You're not just going to walk away? Leave me to figure this out on my own?" "I considered it," I admitted. "For several weeks, I considered it very seriously. But Daniel, whatever else has happened between us, I don't want you dead. I want you to become the person you're capable of being." "And who is that person?" It was a profound question, one that I wasn't sure either of us could answer yet. That's what you're going to have to figure out, I said. But this time, you're going to do it without trust funds or credit cards or family connections to smooth your path. You're going to learn to earn what you receive. Even your love, he asked quietly. I reached out and took his hand, feeling how thin it had become, how fragile he seemed beneath the hospital's harsh fluorescent lighting. My love was never conditional, Daniel. But my trust, my support, my willingness to enable your choices, those things you'll have to earn back.
How?
By becoming someone who deserves them. By building a life based on your own efforts rather than my resources. By proving that you can stand on your own feet before I help cushion your fall again. Dr. Chen appeared in the doorway, making notes on Daniel's chart. How is he doing? She asked, addressing both of us. Better, I said, and meant it. Much better. The psychiatric evaluation won't be complete until tomorrow, but I'm optimistic about his immediate recovery. However, he's going to need ongoing support, therapy, possibly medication for depression, and a stable environment during his transition back to independent living. He'll have that, I said, making a decision I hadn't realized I was prepared to make. After Dr. Chen left, Daniel squeezed my hand weakly. Mom, I don't expect you to take care of me. I know I need to learn to take care of myself. You do, I agreed. But there's a difference between enabling your poor choices and providing basic support while you learn to make better ones. What does that mean? It means you're going to stay with me for a while. Not in your old room. That life is over. You'll stay in the guest suite, and you'll pay rent from whatever job you find. You'll contribute to household expenses, help with maintenance, and follow rules that we'll establish together. Rules. No credit cards. No access to family funds. No using our relationship to advance your career prospects. You'll find work based on your own merits, live within your means, and prove that you can function as an independent adult before we discuss any restoration of family financial support. Daniel was quiet for so long I thought he might have fallen asleep. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. It sounds like you're offering me a chance to start over. I'm offering you a chance to grow up, I corrected. Something I should have insisted on years ago. Why now? After everything I said, everything I did, why are you giving me this chance? I thought about the question seriously before answering. Why was I offering Daniel this opportunity for redemption? Was it love?
Guilt?
Fear that I'd pushed too hard and needed to pull back before I lost him entirely? Because the alternative is losing you forever, I said finally. And despite everything that's happened, despite the cruel words and selfish choices, I'm not ready for that loss. Even though I wished you were dead? Even though you wished I were dead. But Daniel, this is your last chance. If you squander this opportunity, if you revert to entitlement and manipulation, I will walk away permanently. There won't be another hospital visit, another chance to start over. This is it. He nodded, understanding the gravity of what I was offering and what it would cost him if he failed. When can I leave? He asked. Dr. Chen said probably tomorrow, assuming the psychiatric evaluation goes well. And then we go home, and you begin the hardest job you've ever had, becoming a man worthy of the love you took for granted. That evening, I drove to Daniel's storage unit to retrieve his belongings. The sight of his life reduced to a 10 by 10 concrete box was sobering. Expensive furniture mixed with childhood mementos, designer clothing hanging beside college textbooks he'd probably never opened. Among his possessions, I found a framed photograph I hadn't seen in years. Daniel at age 7, gap-toothed and grinning, his arms wrapped around my waist as we stood in the garden Robert and I had just finished planting. He'd insisted on helping that day, though his help had consisted mainly of digging holes in random locations and getting dirt on his good clothes. Looking at that photograph, I realized that the little boy in the picture had been real. The love in his eyes, the joy in his smile, that hadn't been performance or manipulation. Somewhere along the way, that loving child had been buried beneath layers of privilege and entitlement, but perhaps he wasn't entirely lost. Perhaps it wasn't too late to help him find his way back. The drive back to Hartford should have been triumphant. I was bringing my son home, offering him redemption, providing a path back to the relationship we'd both damaged beyond recognition. Instead, the 3-hour journey felt heavy with uncertainty and the weight of conditional love. Daniel sat in the passenger seat, still pale from his hospital stay, clutching the small bag that contained the few possessions he deemed essential. Everything else would remain in storage until he could afford to reclaim it, if he ever could. We spoke little during the drive. What was there to say? The grand gestures were over, the dramatic confrontations complete. What lay ahead was the much harder work of rebuilding trust through small, daily actions. The guest suite has its own entrance, I told him as we turned into my circular driveway. You'll have privacy, but you'll also have independence. No room service, no housekeeping, no meals provided unless you contribute to their preparation. Daniel nodded, studying the house he'd grown up in, as if seeing it for the first time. Perhaps he was. When you've lived somewhere as a prince, returning as a tenant must create an entirely different perspective. Elena greeted us at the door with her usual warm efficiency, but I could see the questions in her eyes as she looked at Daniel's gaunt frame and hollow expression. She'd watched him grow up, had spoiled him almost as much as I had, and his current condition clearly distressed her. Elena, Daniel will be staying in the guest suite for a while, I explained. He'll be responsible for his own meals and housekeeping, but I'm sure he'd appreciate any guidance you might offer about practical matters. Of course, Mrs. Elon, she replied, though her expression suggested she found the formal arrangements puzzling. Elena had known Daniel as the boy who raided her kitchen for cookies and left his clothes scattered across every surface. This version, broken, humble, uncertain, was foreign to her. The guest suite occupied what had once been the chauffeur's apartment above the garage, converted years ago into a comfortable space for visiting relatives who preferred independence. It had a small kitchen, a living area, a bedroom, and a bathroom. Everything Daniel needed to practice being a functional adult. Rent is $800 a month, I told him as we surveyed the space. Utilities are included, but you'll buy your own food and handle your own laundry. You'll also contribute 10 hours a week to household maintenance, gardening, cleaning, general upkeep. $800, Daniel repeated quietly. I don't have $800. Then you have approximately 30 days to find employment that will generate $800 monthly, plus enough additional income to cover food, transportation, and personal expenses. The reality of his situation seemed to hit him fresh, and I watched him calculate mentally. Minimum wage jobs, entry-level positions, the gap between what he needed to earn and what someone with his current reputation could realistically command. Mom, he said finally, what if I can't find work? What if no one will hire me? Then you'll have to be more creative about your approach. Or more willing to accept positions you previously considered beneath you. It was harsh, but necessarily so. Daniel had spent his entire adult life believing that his surname and family connections would open doors. He needed to learn that closed doors could only be opened through his own efforts. Over the following weeks, I watched my son attempt to navigate the adult world he'd never been required to master. The process was painful for both of us, though in different ways. Daniel's first job interviews were disasters. Accustomed to charm and family reputation carrying him through professional interactions, he struggled when forced to rely on actual qualifications and work experience. His resume, while impressive on paper with his Ivy League education, crumbled under scrutiny when interviewers discovered that most of his accomplishments had been facilitated by family resources rather than personal merit. They asked me to name my greatest professional achievement, he told me after a particularly brutal interview at a local construction firm. And I realized that everything I thought I'd achieved at Morrison had really been your achievement, or Dad's, or just the result of money opening doors. And what did you tell them? The truth. That I was starting over and wanted to earn my first real professional achievement at their company.
He paused.
They didn't hire me, but gradually, slowly, Daniel began to adapt. He took a job at a landscaping company, physical labor that left him exhausted and sore but also oddly satisfied. The work was completely different from his previous construction management role, requiring him to start from the bottom and prove himself through actual performance rather than family connections. He learned to budget his small salary, to shop for groceries with actual price consciousness, to maintain his living space because no one else would do it for him. The change wasn't immediate or dramatic. There were setbacks, moments of frustration when Daniel reverted to entitlement or self-pity. But there were also small victories. His first successful month of paying rent on time, his promotion from basic landscaping to crew leader, his gradual rebuilding of professional references based on actual performance rather than family connections. Most importantly, Daniel began therapy with a psychologist who specialized in addiction and family dysfunction.
Dr.
Rachel Martinez was skilled at identifying patterns of codependency and entitlement, and she didn't allow Daniel to hide behind excuses or blame. She makes me talk about things I've never had to examine, Daniel told me after one particularly difficult session. Like why I felt entitled to your financial support without giving you emotional respect. Or why I thought I deserved inheritance without ever contributing to the family's well-being. And what answers are you finding? Uncomfortable ones, he admitted. Mostly that I've been a selfish coward who took the easy path whenever possible and called it love. Our relationship during this period was complex and often strained. I found myself walking a careful line between supportive landlord and distant mother, wanting to encourage Daniel's growth without enabling his old patterns of dependency. There were moments of genuine connection. Evenings when he'd help me in the garden and we'd talk about plants, weather, neutral topics that didn't require us to navigate the minefield of our shared history. There were also moments of tension, when Daniel would slip into old expectations, or when I would catch myself wanting to smooth his path out of maternal instinct. I keep waiting for you to rescue me, he confessed one evening as we transplanted orchids in the greenhouse. Even though I know you won't, part of me keeps expecting you to step in and fix things when they get difficult. And how does it feel when I don't? Terrifying, he said honestly. But also freeing? Like, maybe for the first time in my life, my successes and failures are actually mine. 6 months after Daniel's hospital stay, Thomas provided me with a progress report I hadn't requested but apparently felt I needed. Your son has maintained steady employment for 4 months, he reported. He's been promoted twice at the landscaping company and has enrolled in night classes to complete certification in landscape architecture. His therapy sessions are consistent, his rent payments are prompt, and he's begun saving money for the first time in his adult life. And personally, no romantic relationships, which is probably wise given his recent experiences. But he's developing what appear to be genuine friendships with his coworkers, relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial advantage. I felt a cautious pride in Daniel's progress, though I was careful not to express it too openly. He still had months, possibly years, of proving himself before I would consider him fully redeemed. The first real test of Daniel's transformation came 8 months after his hospital stay, when Patricia called with news that would have once sent him into a frenzy of expectation. Miriam, I've received an interesting offer on the Hartford property, she said. A developer wants to purchase the entire estate for conversion into luxury condominiums. The offer is substantial. The number she quoted was staggering, enough to fund a lavish retirement anywhere in the world, enough to ensure that money would never again be a concern for the remainder of my life. What would you like to do? Patricia asked. I found myself thinking not about the money, but about Daniel's reaction when he learned about the offer. The old Daniel would have seen dollar signs, would have begun calculating his share and planning his spending. But would the new Daniel see it as an opportunity or a test? Let me think about it, I told Patricia. This isn't a decision to make lightly. That evening, I told Daniel about the offer over dinner, a simple meal we'd prepared together in the main house kitchen, a routine we developed that felt domestic and normal in ways our relationship had never been before. His initial reaction was surprise, followed quickly by what looked like genuine concern. Are you going to sell? He asked. I don't know. It's a lot of money, but it's also the only home you've ever known. The place where your father and I built our life together. Daniel was quiet for a long time, and I could see him wrestling with thoughts he wasn't sure he should voice. Mom, he said finally, I need to tell you something, and I need you to believe that I'm not saying it because I'm angling for financial benefit. Go on. If you want to sell the house and travel, or move somewhere that makes you happier, you should do it. Don't factor me into the decision. I mean that. I've learned to take care of myself, and I don't want you to feel responsible for providing me with a safety net anymore. It was perhaps the most mature thing Daniel had ever said to me, and I felt tears prick my eyes as I recognized the man he was slowly becoming. And if I did sell? If I moved away? Then I'd be sad to see you go, but I'd be proud that you were living your life for yourself instead of for me. That night, I sat in Robert's study and made 2 phone calls. The first was to Patricia, declining the developer's offer. The second was to Jonathan, requesting a meeting to discuss modifications to my estate planning. Not because Daniel had earned back his inheritance, that would take years to determine, but because he'd finally earned something more valuable, the right to be considered as an individual rather than as an extension of my wealth. It was progress. Slow, difficult, uncertain progress, but progress nonetheless. The little boy from the photograph was still buried somewhere inside the man working double shifts to pay his rent. Whether he could fully emerge remained to be seen, but for the first time since that devastating night in Chicago, I had reason to hope. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, almost exactly 1 year after Daniel's overdose. Elena brought it to me with the rest of the mail, but something in her expression suggested this wasn't routine correspondence. The envelope bore the letterhead of Morrison and Associates Construction, the firm that had terminated Daniel and threatened him with fraud charges. My first instinct was alarm. Had they decided to pursue legal action despite my secret settlement? But as I read the contents, alarm gave way to amazement. Dear Mrs. Elon, I hope this letter finds you well. I am writing to inform you of a situation involving your son, Daniel, that I believe you should know about. 6 months ago, Daniel approached our firm with an unusual request. Rather than seeking employment or attempting to restore his previous position, he asked if he could work, unpaid, to help offset the financial losses his misrepresentations had caused our company. Initially, we declined his offer. The damage to our relationship seemed irreparable, and frankly, we questioned his motives. However, Daniel persisted, presenting a detailed plan for how he could contribute to our upcoming projects while learning proper business practices under close supervision. Against our better judgment, we agreed to a trial arrangement. I set the letter down, my hands trembling slightly. Daniel had never mentioned this to me. In all our conversations about his job at the landscaping company, his night school classes, his slowly improving finances, he never said a word about attempting to make amends with Morrison. Over the past 6 months, the letter continued, Daniel has exceeded every expectation we had. He has worked weekends and evenings without compensation, contributing to 3 major projects while completing his landscape architecture certification through night school. His work has been exemplary, his attitude professional, and his commitment to learning genuine. More importantly, Daniel has insisted on personally repaying the financial losses his actions cost our firm. While the original settlement was handled through other channels, Daniel calculated the amount independently and has been making monthly payments from his landscaping salary. At his current rate of payment, he will have repaid the full $400,000 within 7 years. $400,000. Daniel was attempting to repay $400,000 from a landscaping salary that probably didn't exceed $30,000 annually. The mathematics were staggering. It meant he was living on almost nothing, dedicating virtually every dollar he earned to this impossible debt. We are writing to inform you that, effective next month, we are offering Daniel a full-time position as a junior project manager with a salary commensurate with his experience and education. We are also suspending his debt repayment plan, considering his voluntary service and excellent performance adequate compensation for past losses. Your son has grown into a man of integrity and determination. You should be proud. Sincerely, Margaret Morrison, Senior Partner, Morrison and Associates Construction. I read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of Daniel's transformation that I hadn't recognized. While I'd been watching him pay rent and attend therapy, measuring his progress in small, domestic improvements, he'd been undertaking a much larger project of redemption. The scope of his commitment was breathtaking. 7 years of sacrifice to repay a debt that legally didn't exist, that had already been settled without his knowledge. $400,000 that would have consumed his entire adult life, paid back not because he was required to, but because he believed it was right. That evening, I found Daniel in his small kitchen, preparing what looked like another meal of rice and vegetables, the kind of austere dinner I'd observed him eating for months, without questioning. "Daniel," I said, placing the Morrison letter on his counter. "We need to talk." He looked at the letter, then at me, his face cycling through surprise, embarrassment, and resignation. "You weren't supposed to know about that," he said quietly. $400,000, Daniel. You were planning to spend 7 years of your life repaying money you don't legally owe. "I owe it morally," he replied without hesitation. "I lied to them, caused them financial damage, destroyed their trust. The fact that someone else settled the legal debt doesn't change my responsibility for creating it." I sat down across from him at the small table where he ate his solitary meals, trying to process the magnitude of what he'd undertaken. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because it wasn't about you," he said simply. "For the first time in my adult life, I was doing something that wasn't designed to impress you or gain your approval or access your resources. I needed to fix what I'd broken myself, using my own efforts." The words hit me with unexpected force. Daniel was right. For 32 years, everything he'd done had been filtered through our relationship, through his role as my son and heir. This was the first time he'd acted purely from personal conscience. "The debt has already been paid, Daniel. I settled with Morrison over a year ago." He stared at me for a long moment. "You paid them?" "I paid them to avoid criminal charges that would have destroyed your life permanently. But you never told me. Because you needed to believe that the consequences were real, that your actions had permanent costs. If you'd known I'd fixed everything behind the scenes, what would you have learned?" Daniel was quiet for a very long time, and I could see him working through the implications of what I'd revealed. "So everything I've been doing, the debt repayment, the unpaid work, it was all unnecessary?" "Legally, yes." "Morally?" I paused, considering my words carefully. "What you've been doing shows me who you've become in ways that no amount of therapy or rent payments could demonstrate." "And who have I become?" "Someone who takes responsibility for his mistakes. Someone who understands that integrity isn't about legal obligations, but about personal honor. Someone who can sacrifice immediate gratification for long-term principles." Daniel laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "It's ironic, isn't it? I spent years taking your money for granted, treating your support as an entitlement. Now I've spent a year impoverishing myself to repay money you'd already paid. It's not ironic, I said firmly. It's growth. The Daniel who overdosed in that motel room wouldn't have been capable of what you've accomplished this year. He would have seen the debt settlement as permission to return to his old patterns. But I've been living like a monk, Mom. Eating rice and vegetables, wearing clothes from thrift stores, walking to work to save on gas. I've been punishing myself for mistakes that had already been forgiven. Have you been unhappy? The question seemed to surprise him. No, he said after a moment. I've been purposeful, focused. I knew exactly why I was making sacrifices, and it felt meaningful in a way my old life never did. Then it wasn't punishment. It was penance. And there's a difference. I reached across the table and took his hand, rough now from manual labor, calloused from real work, but steady in a way it hadn't been during his years of privilege. Daniel, I'm proud of you. Not because you've repaid an imaginary debt, but because you became the kind of person who would try to repay it. That transformation is worth more than any amount of money. Does this mean? He started, then stopped, as if afraid to voice his hope. Does this mean what? Does this mean I've earned the right to be your son again? It was the question I'd been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. The question that would define the rest of our relationship. You never lost the right to be my son, I said carefully. But you did lose the right to expect certain things from that relationship.
Trust.
Financial support. Unconditional approval of your choices. And now, I looked at the man sitting across from me, thin from his voluntary austerity, tired from working 2 jobs while attending night school, but with eyes that held a clarity and purpose I'd never seen before. Now, we start building a new kind of relationship, one based on mutual respect rather than dependency. One where your worth isn't measured by your inheritance prospects or my willingness to finance your dreams. What does that look like practically? It looks like Morrison and Associates job offer, which you're going to accept. It looks like continuing to live independently while we slowly rebuild trust. It looks like family dinners where we talk as equals rather than as creditor and debtor. Daniel squeezed my hand, and for the first time in over a year, his smile was genuinely happy. And eventually, he asked, eventually, do you think? Eventually, if you continue to be the man you've become rather than reverting to the boy you were, we might rebuild something even stronger than what we had before. Something based on choice rather than obligation. That night, I updated my will for the 3rd time in 2 years. Not to restore Daniel's inheritance, that would come later, if at all, but to reflect a new reality. My son was no longer a dependent child or an entitled adult. He was a work in progress, someone earning his way back to full family membership through consistency and character. The process would take years. Trust once shattered, rebuild slowly. But watching Daniel choose integrity over comfort, responsibility over entitlement, had shown me that the little boy from the garden photograph hadn't been lost after all. He'd simply been buried beneath years of unearned privilege. And now, through the most difficult year of his life, he was finally digging himself out. The man who emerged might not be the son I'd originally planned to raise. But he was becoming someone far more valuable, a son I could genuinely respect. 2 years, 3 months, and 16 days after I'd driven through that storm to surprise my son with birthday cake, I stood in the same Chicago hallway where everything had changed. But this time, I wasn't carrying gifts or expectations. I was carrying keys. Daniel stood beside me, studying the door to his old apartment with an expression I couldn't quite read. The building looked the same, trendy, expensive, designed for young professionals with more money than sense. But we were both different people than we'd been that devastating night. The lease is in your name now, I told him, handing him the keys. Market rate rent, no family guarantees, no backup funding. Just a standard rental agreement between you and the landlord. He turned the keys over in his hands, hands that bore calluses from 2 years of real work, that had learned to build things rather than simply acquire them. "I can't afford this place on my Morrison salary," he said honestly. "Not yet," I agreed. "But Morrison is promoting you to senior project manager next month, and the salary increase will make it feasible." "Barely, but feasible." Daniel smiled ruefully. "You've been talking to Margaret Morrison." "I've been keeping track of your progress, yes. Not interfering, not smoothing your path, just observing." It was true. Over the past year, I'd watched from a careful distance as Daniel transformed from a broken man eating rice and vegetables in a converted garage apartment to a respected professional earning his place in an industry that had once rejected him. The transformation hadn't been easy or linear. There had been setbacks, moments of doubt, times when the old Daniel's entitlement would surface like a chronic condition. But each time, he'd recognized the relapse and corrected course, usually without prompting from me or his therapist. "Why this apartment?" he asked. "Of all the places in Chicago, why bring me back here?" It was a fair question, one I'd wrestled with for weeks before making the decision. "Because this is where you need to prove to yourself that you've really changed," I said. "Anyone can succeed in a new environment with a fresh start. But can you succeed in the same place where you once failed, surrounded by the same temptations and opportunities for regression?" Daniel walked to the window that looked out over Lincoln Park, the same window where I'd seen his silhouette that night 2 years ago. But his posture was different now, straighter, more solid, less like someone performing a role, and more like someone comfortable in his own skin. "The last time I lived here, I was planning a future built on your death," he said quietly. "I was counting inheritance money I hadn't earned, making promises I couldn't keep, and wishing away the one person who actually loved me. And now I'm planning a future built on my own work. It's smaller, less glamorous, but it's real. And more importantly, it includes you as a living, breathing person I want to spend time with, not as a financial obstacle I need to overcome." We spent the afternoon moving Daniel's belongings from storage back into the apartment. It was a strange experience, unpacking the remnants of his old life. Expensive furniture that now seemed gaudy, designer clothes that no longer fit his lifestyle, gadgets and toys that had once defined his identity. "I don't need most of this stuff," he said, surveying the accumulation of his privileged years. "What do you want to do with it?" "Sell it. Use the money to furnish the apartment properly for who I am now, not who I used to be." That evening, we had dinner at a modest restaurant in the neighborhood. Nothing like the expensive establishments Daniel used to frequent, but comfortable and authentic in ways Alinea could never be. "I have something to tell you," Daniel said over dessert. "Something I've been working toward for months." I felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. Our relationship was still fragile, still being rebuilt brick by brick. I wasn't ready for any major revelations that might disrupt the careful progress we'd made. "I've been seeing someone," he continued, and my heart sank slightly. "Her name is Rachel, and she's a teacher at an elementary school on the South Side." "How long?" "6 months. We met at a community gardening project I volunteer at on weekends. She has no idea about my family background, my trust fund, any of it. To her, I'm just Daniel Elon, the guy who works in construction and grows tomatoes in his spare time." "And you haven't told her about your past?" Daniel was quiet for a moment. "I've told her that I made some serious mistakes in my 20s, hurt people I cared about, and spent several years learning how to be a better person. She knows I was hospitalized for depression, and that I'm in ongoing therapy. She doesn't know about the money, the trust fund, the inheritance prospects." "Don't you think she deserves to know?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "And I'm going to tell her. But I wanted to make sure our relationship was based on who I am now, not who I might become if you die, or what I might inherit if I play my cards right." It was a mature approach, one that showed Daniel had learned from his devastating experience with Sophia. but it also created a new complexity in our family dynamic. When do I get to meet her? I asked. That depends. On what? Daniel took a deep breath, as if preparing for a difficult conversation. On whether you can meet her as Rachel's boyfriend's mother, not as Miriam Elon, wealthy widow with an estate worth millions. I understood immediately. Daniel wanted to protect his relationship from the corrupting influence of family wealth, the same influence that had attracted Sophia and destroyed his professional reputation. You want me to hide who I am? I want you to be who you are, my mom, without the financial complications. At least until Rachel and I are solid enough to handle those complications. It was a reasonable request, one that showed Daniel was thinking strategically about protecting something valuable rather than simply exploiting it. But it also highlighted the ongoing challenge of our relationship: how to be a normal family when so much of our history was tied to abnormal wealth. All right, I agreed. But I won't lie about my life. I'll just emphasize different aspects of it. That's all I'm asking. We walked back to Daniel's building in comfortable silence, both of us processing the significance of the day. He was back in the place where his old life had collapsed, but as a fundamentally different person. The apartment would be the same, but everything else, his income, his relationships, his priorities, his character, had been rebuilt from the ground up. Daniel, I said as we reached his door, I want you to know that regardless of what happens with inheritance or family money in the future, I'm proud of who you've become. The trust fund, the estate plans, all of that, it's secondary to the fact that you've become a man of integrity. Does that mean? It means we'll have that conversation when the time is right. When you've proven not just to me, but to yourself, that wealth won't corrupt the person you've worked so hard to become. Daniel hugged me then, not the perfunctory embraces of his entitled years, but the real hug of someone who'd learned the value of love by nearly losing it forever. Thank you, Mom.
For not giving up on me.
For letting me earn my way back. For loving me enough to let me fail. Thank you for becoming someone worth saving. As I drove back to Hartford that night, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point. 2 years ago, I'd set out to teach my ungrateful son a lesson about taking his mother's love for granted. What I'd learned instead was that love without boundaries isn't love at all, it's enabling. The Daniel I'd raised through privilege and protection had been weak, selfish, and ultimately self-destructive. The Daniel who'd rebuilt himself through struggle and accountability was someone I genuinely enjoyed spending time with, someone whose judgment I'd begun to trust, someone who might eventually be worthy of inheriting not just money, but the responsibility that came with it. 3 months later, I met Rachel Santos at a backyard barbecue Daniel had organized at his apartment. She was everything Sophia hadn't been: genuine, unpretentious, interested in Daniel's character rather than his prospects. She taught 4th grade at a school where most of the students qualified for free lunch, and she spoke about her work with the kind of passion that comes from true calling rather than career calculation. Daniel told me you're in property management, she said as we sat on his modest balcony, watching him tend to the herb garden he'd started. Something like that, I replied, sticking to the carefully neutral description we'd agreed on. I help manage real estate investments. He's so proud of his work at Morrison, she continued. The way he talks about those construction projects, you'd think he was building cathedrals instead of office complexes. I watched my son through the sliding glass door, carefully watering basil plants he'd grown from seed. His face held a contentment I'd never seen during his years of easy privilege. He's learned to take pride in honest work, I said. He told me he had some tough years in his 20s, made mistakes that hurt people he cared about. It takes courage to admit that kind of thing. Yes, I agreed. It does. That evening, after Rachel had gone home and we were cleaning up the party debris, Daniel and I talked about the relationship. She's wonderful, I told him honestly. Grounded, intelligent, genuinely caring. Nothing like Sophia, he finished. I know. That's not an accident, Mom. I've learned to recognize the difference between someone who loves me and someone who loves what they think I can provide them. And Rachel? Rachel bought me a book about sustainable gardening for my birthday. A $12 paperback that she picked because she thought I'd enjoy learning new techniques for the community garden. Sophia spent our entire relationship trying to get me to buy her things that cost more than Rachel probably makes in a month. The contrast was telling. Sophia had been focused on extraction, what she could get from Daniel and, by extension, from me. Rachel seemed focused on contribution, what she could add to Daniel's life and growth. Are you going to tell her about the family situation? I asked. Eventually, when I'm confident that the information won't change how she sees me or our relationship. But Mom, there's something else I need to tell you, and it might be harder to hear. I braced myself for another revelation. I don't want the inheritance. The words hit me like a physical blow. What? I don't want the trust fund restored, don't want to be named in your will, don't want any of the family money. I want to build my life on what I can earn and achieve myself. I stared at him, trying to process this unexpected declaration. Daniel, you're talking about millions of dollars. The house, the art collection, the investment portfolio. All of which would turn me back into someone I despise, he interrupted. Mom, I've learned something important over the past 2 years. I'm happier earning $40,000 a year and knowing it's mine than I ever was spending your money and feeling like I owed you my entire life. But the family legacy will be better served by someone who actually deserves it than by someone who inherits it through accident of birth. Set up a charitable foundation, leave it to causes you care about, establish scholarships for kids who don't have the advantages I had. Do something meaningful with it instead of just passing it along to someone who already proved he can't handle that kind of responsibility. I felt as if the ground beneath me was shifting. For 2 years, I'd been working toward the possibility of restoring Daniel to his position as my heir. Now he was rejecting that possibility entirely. This is a permanent decision you're talking about, I said carefully. Once I restructure everything, once I remove you from inheritance considerations, it would be very difficult to undo. I understand. And I'm asking you to make it permanent. Make it legally impossible for me to inherit the family wealth, even if something happens to you tomorrow. I need to know that my relationship with you, my marriage to Rachel if that happens, my children if I'm blessed to have them, I need to know that none of it will ever be contaminated by financial considerations. It was perhaps the most selfless thing Daniel had ever said to me, and also the most frightening. He was asking me to sever the financial connection that had defined our relationship for his entire life. What if you change your mind? What if Rachel wants a different lifestyle, or you have children who need educational opportunities you can't afford on a construction salary? Then we'll find another way. We'll work harder, save more, make sacrifices. You know what, Mom? Poor people raise children successfully, every day. They send kids to college, help them build good lives, pass along values that matter. They do it without trust funds, and they do it without guilt. I walked to the railing of his balcony, looking out over the Chicago skyline that had been the backdrop for so much of our family's drama. Somewhere in those buildings, other wealthy families were probably struggling with the same issues that had nearly destroyed ours. Children who felt entitled to inheritance they hadn't earned, parents who confused financial provision with love, relationships corrupted by money that should have been based on genuine affection. Are you certain about this, Daniel? Absolutely certain. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. That night, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to Jonathan, asking him to begin the legal process of removing Daniel from all inheritance documents and establishing a charitable foundation that would receive the bulk of my estate. The second was to Patricia, instructing her to begin the complex process of restructuring my investments to support long-term charitable giving rather than family wealth transfer. It felt like a kind of death, the death of dynastic dreams, of family legacy in the traditional sense, of the fairy tale ending where the wayward son reclaims his birthright through moral transformation. But it also felt like a birth. The birth of a new kind of family relationship, one based on mutual respect rather than financial dependency. The birth of a new purpose for wealth that had sometimes felt more like a burden than a blessing. It would be a small ceremony in the community garden where they'd met, followed by a reception in the elementary school gymnasium where Rachel taught. No expensive flowers, no designer dresses, no lavish reception at an exclusive venue. But the love in the invitation's simple language, the joy in their engagement photos, the excitement in Daniel's voice when he called to ask if I'd walk him down the aisle in his father's absence, all of it was more valuable than any wedding my money could have purchased. "Will you be okay with such a simple celebration?" Daniel asked during one of our planning conversations. "I'll be honored to be part of such an authentic one," I replied. And I meant it. The woman who'd driven 11 hours through a storm to surprise her ungrateful son with expensive gifts was gone forever. In her place stood someone who'd learned that the best gifts, love, respect, genuine relationship, could never be bought, only earned. Daniel had earned them all. As I sat in my study that evening, writing my acceptance to their wedding invitation, I reflected on the journey that had brought us here. I'd set out to teach my son the value of a mother's love by withdrawing it. What I'd learned instead was that love without boundaries wasn't love at all. It was a form of slow poison that killed both the giver and receiver. Real love, I discovered, sometimes required letting people fail spectacularly so they could learn to succeed authentically. It required holding people accountable for their choices while continuing to believe in their capacity for growth. Most importantly, it required the courage to step back and let people prove their worth rather than simply inheriting it. My phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. "Rachel and I are registering for wedding gifts tomorrow. Fair warning, we're asking for practical things like kitchen utensils and bath towels. Hope that's not too disappointing after all those years of expensive taste." I smiled as I typed my response. After all these years, practical gifts from a loving heart are exactly what I've been hoping for. It was true. The son who'd once wished for my death so he could inherit my money had become a man who'd chosen love over legacy, relationship over riches, authentic connection over artificial privilege. He'd cried like a baby when his world collapsed, just as I'd planned. But from those tears had emerged something I'd never dared hope for, a son I could genuinely respect, admire, and love without reservation. The inheritance he'd rejected was worth millions. The man he'd become was priceless. And unlike money, no one could ever take that away from him. The garden photography session was Rachel's idea. She wanted professional pictures of Daniel with his daughter, Emma, among the tomatoes and herbs they grew together in the backyard of their modest Chicago home. I watched from the kitchen window as Daniel lifted his 2-year-old daughter to pick cherry tomatoes, both of them laughing when she popped one in her mouth instead of adding it to their basket. Emma had inherited Daniel's eyes and Rachel's gentle spirit, but she had something neither of her parents had possessed at her age: the security of knowing she was loved for who she was, not who she might become or what she might provide. "Grandma Miriam, come help," Emma called, spotting me at the window. Her vocabulary was impressive for her age, but then she was surrounded by adults who read to her constantly, who answered her endless questions with patience and genuine interest. I joined them in the garden, accepting my role as assistant tomato picker with appropriate seriousness. Emma had very specific standards for which tomatoes were ready for harvest, and she explained them to me with the kind of detailed instruction that only a 2-year-old could provide. "This one's perfect, Grandma," she announced, holding up a slightly green tomato that clearly needed another week on the vine. "You're absolutely right," I said, adding it to our basket. Some lessons were more important than perfect produce. Daniel caught my eye over Emma's head and smiled. At 37, He looked nothing like the entitled young man I'd once raised. His hands were permanently stained from garden soil and construction work, his face showed lines from spending days in the sun, and his clothes came from discount stores rather than designer boutiques. He'd never looked more handsome. "Mom," he said as Emma ran off to chase a butterfly, "Rachel and I have been talking, and we want to ask you something." "What kind of something?" Rachel emerged from the house carrying lemonade and wearing the expression of someone about to broach a delicate subject. "We're thinking about buying a house," she said, settling onto the garden bench Daniel had built from reclaimed wood. "Nothing fancy, just a small place with a bigger yard for Emma and maybe room for another child someday." "That sounds wonderful," I said carefully. Over the years, I'd learned to be cautious about expressing too much enthusiasm for their plans, lest they interpret it as an offer of financial assistance. "The thing is," Daniel continued, "we've saved enough for a down payment on something modest, but we're not sure we can qualify for a mortgage that would get us the kind of neighborhood we want for Emma's schools." I waited, understanding that they were building toward a request, but unsure what form it would take. "We're not asking for money," Rachel said quickly. "We know that's not how your relationship works anymore, and honestly, we don't want financial help. We want to earn what we have." "But," I prompted gently. "But we were wondering if you might be willing to write a character reference," Daniel said. "Something for the bank that speaks to our stability, our commitment to meeting obligations. Not a financial guarantee, just a personal recommendation from someone who's known me for a long time and can vouch for my character." It was such a small request, such a normal thing for a parent to do for an adult child, that I felt tears prick my eyes. 5 years ago, Daniel would have asked me to buy him the house outright. 2 years ago, he would have expected me to co-sign the mortgage. Now he was simply asking for a letter of recommendation based on his character. I'd be honored to write that letter, I told them. That evening, after Emma had been tucked into bed with the complicated ritual of stuffed animals and bedtime stories that defined her routine, the three of us sat on Daniel's back porch discussing their house hunting plans. "We're looking at places in Rachel's school district," Daniel explained. "Nothing big or fancy, but safe neighborhoods with good public schools and reasonable commute times to my job sites." "Have you considered the North Shore?" I asked. "There are some lovely communities out there, excellent schools." "Way out of our price range," Rachel said with a laugh. "We're looking at 3-bedroom starter homes, not estates." "Besides," Daniel added, "we want Emma to grow up understanding that good things come from hard work, not from having rich relatives. The house we can afford on our combined salaries is the house we should live in." It was a philosophy I'd come to deeply respect. Even when it meant watching them struggle with financial constraints I could easily eliminate. Daniel and Rachel had created a life based on their own efforts, their own values, their own definition of success. It was smaller than what I could provide, but it was entirely theirs. "There is one thing," Rachel said hesitantly. "Daniel's been offered a promotion to regional manager, which would mean more travel but significantly better pay. We're trying to decide if it's worth the time away from Emma." "What does your gut tell you?" I asked. "That Emma needs her daddy around more than she needs a bigger house," Daniel replied without hesitation. "The promotion would be good for my career, but she's only going to be little once." It was the kind of wisdom that couldn't be taught, only learned through experience and genuine love. The Daniel I'd originally raised might have taken the promotion automatically, focused on the financial advancement without considering the family cost. This Daniel weighed decisions based on what mattered most to him, and what mattered most was being present for his daughter's childhood. "Speaking of Emma," I said, reaching into my purse, "I brought something for her." I pulled out a children's book, not an expensive first edition or collector's item, but a simple picture book about gardening that I'd found at a local bookstore. "She's been talking about planting flowers," I explained as Rachel examined the book. "I thought she might enjoy the pictures." "She'll love it," Rachel said warmly. You always choose perfect books for her. It was true. Over the years, I'd learned Emma's interests and preferences, had developed a genuine relationship with her that had nothing to do with financial considerations. I was simply Grandma Miriam who brought books and helped in the garden and listened to endless stories about preschool adventures. As I drove home to Hartford that night, I reflected on the evening's conversations and what they revealed about the family Daniel and Rachel had built together. They were making decisions based on their values rather than their bank account, prioritizing relationships over career advancement, choosing contentment over acquisition. It was everything I'd hoped for when I'd first decided to cut Daniel off from family money, but it was also more than I'd dared expect. They weren't just financially independent. They were emotionally and spiritually independent, creating their own definition of success rather than pursuing someone else's version of the good life. 3 weeks later, I received a text from Daniel with a photo attached. The keys to their new house, a modest colonial in a tree-lined neighborhood where children rode bicycles on sidewalks and neighbors knew each other's names. We got the house, his message read. Bank approved the mortgage based on our financial history and credit scores. Your character reference definitely helped, but they were most impressed by our savings rate and payment consistency. Move-in date is next month. I stared at the photo for a long time, remembering another set of keys I'd given Daniel years ago, the keys to a Chicago apartment that I'd paid for, guaranteed, and ultimately enabled him to take for granted. These keys represented something entirely different, a home earned through their own efforts, purchased with their own money, chosen based on their own priorities. The difference was profound. That afternoon, I called Jonathan to discuss updating my will once again. Not to restore Daniel's inheritance, but to establish a small college fund for Emma and any future grandchildren. Not enough to make them wealthy, just enough to ensure they'd have educational opportunities their parents' middle-class income might not stretch to cover. You know, Jonathan said as we discussed the trust structure, Daniel could have been a very wealthy man if he'd simply maintained his relationship with you on the old terms. Yes, I agreed. He could have been very wealthy and very miserable, just as he was before everything changed. And now, I thought about Daniel in his garden with Emma, about Rachel grading papers at their kitchen table, about the contentment in their voices as they discussed mortgage payments and home repairs, and the thousand small details of a life built on genuine love rather than financial convenience. Now he's rich in ways that matter, I said. Ways that can't be taken away by market crashes or family disputes or changes in inheritance law. That evening, I received another text from Daniel, a photo of Emma reading her new gardening book to her stuffed animals, explaining to them in serious tones about soil and seeds and the importance of watering. She says she wants to plant flowers for you next time you visit, the message read. Fair warning, she has very specific ideas about what colors flowers should be. I smiled as I saved the photo to my phone, adding it to the collection of images that documented Emma's growth and Daniel's transformation. Somewhere in my house were photo albums from Daniel's childhood, birthday parties and Christmas mornings and vacation trips, all expensively documented, but somehow lacking the authentic joy I saw in these simple pictures of daily life. The difference was that these photos captured moments of genuine happiness rather than performed gratitude. They showed a family that had chosen to be together rather than one held together by financial obligation. As I prepared for bed that night, I realized that the revenge I'd originally planned had succeeded beyond my wildest dreams. I'd set out to show Daniel what life would be like without his devoted, financially supportive mother. What I'd accomplished instead was showing him what life could be like with authentic relationships, personal integrity, and genuine self-respect. The son who'd once wished for my death, so he could inherit my money, had become a man who'd rejected that inheritance to preserve his own soul. He'd cried like a baby when his world of privilege collapsed, just as I'd planned. But from those tears had emerged something I never thought possible, a son I could love without reservation, respect without qualification, and trust without fear. He'd chosen character over cash, authenticity over acquisition, real love over financial convenience. And in doing so, he'd given both of us something far more valuable than any inheritance could ever provide: the gift of a relationship based on genuine affection rather than economic necessity. The perfect revenge, it turned out, wasn't making my ungrateful son suffer for his cruelty. It was helping him become someone who could never be that cruel again. Someone who understood that love given freely was worth infinitely more than money inherited by accident of birth. Someone who'd learned that the most important things in life, character, integrity, genuine relationships, couldn't be bought, only earned. My son had earned them all. And that was the most beautiful ending I could have ever imagined. And that, my friends, is the power of a mother's love, betrayed, but transformed into an unstoppable force for justice. Miriam's journey reminds us that even when cruelty cuts deepest, we can find the strength to reclaim our dignity and to build a life so beautiful it becomes its own profound revenge. If Miriam's story resonated with you, if you believe in the power of a woman's comeback, then hit that subscribe button, join the Her Journey family, and let's continue to share these incredible tales of resilience and triumph together. Until next time, stay strong, stay true, and remember, your journey is just beginning.